Welcome to 101 Stories from Ambient Whisper. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. The silent ash and the fire team I spent the rest of the night sitting perhaps 20 yards from the glowing embers, my flashlight beam occasionally sweeping over the silent clearing. I didn't approach the fire again. My training said to observe, not to interfere, especially with an active hot spot. But a deeper, primal instinct kept me at a respectful distance from the impossible phenomenon. The hours passed with excruciating slowness. The sky eventually began to lighten, the black giving way to a bruised purple, then a soft, hesitant gray. The world slowly returned to its more familiar sounds, the first tentative chirps of birds, the rustle of leaves in a faint morning breeze. As the sun began to peek over the eastern ridges, painting the forest in soft, golden light, the fire team arrived. I heard the distant rumble of their ATVs long before I saw them. Three figures, clad in sturdy green and yellow fire-resistant gear, emerged from the trees, their faces grim, their tools slung over their shoulders. Beatrice was with them, her face etched with a mixture of concern and professional exhaustion. She took one look at my face, then at the small, perfect circle of embers. "Elias, are you all right?" she asked, her voice softer than it had been on the radio. "I'm fine, Beatrice," I replied, my voice hoarse from disuse. "The fire's just as I reported. Small, contained. No active smoke." The fire team leader, a burly man named Frank with a perpetually skeptical expression, knelt by the embers. He poked at them with a gloved hand. "Well, it'll be damned," he muttered. "It's a perfect ring, like someone drew it with a compass." He looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "No signs of a campfire, Elias. No broken branches, no fire ring, no trash. Nothing," I confirmed, "just the embers, and that." I pointed to the ash footprint. Frank leaned in, his brows furrowed. He reached out a gloved finger and carefully traced the outline of the ash impression. "Looks like a foot, but it's just ash. No actual pressure mark in the dirt." One of the other firefighters, a young man named David, looked at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "It's almost like someone left a carbon copy of their foot." Beatrice, ever the pragmatist, cleared her throat. "All right, team. Let's get this hot spot put out and investigate the surrounding area. Frank, take the lead with the shovel. David, get the water pump ready." They began the methodical process of dousing the embers, carefully turning over the dirt, ensuring no spark remained. I watched them work, the mundane efficiency of their actions a strange contrast to the impossible origin of the fire. As Frank dug, he suddenly stopped. "Hold on," he said, picking something out of the dirt with his gloved hand. It was a small, smooth, dark stone, perfectly oval and still warm to the touch. He handed it to Beatrice. She turned it over in her palm. Volcanic glass, obsidian maybe." I recognized it immediately. It was similar to the river stone Silas had given me, the kind that absorbed noise. This one, however, felt different. It hummed with a subtle internal warmth. "It feels like it was part of the fire," David observed, looking over her shoulder, "like it was heated from the inside." Beatrice tossed the stone gently from hand to hand. "Odd. Well, log it." "Elias, did you see anyone out here last night? Any vehicles, any unusual lights before you spotted this?" I hesitated for a long moment. How much could I say? "I saw a light, Beatrice, before the fire. It was moving, and it was small, but it was definitely moving." She looked at me, her gaze steady. "What kind of moving, Elias? Like?" "Walking," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "It looked like a small, human-shaped flame walking in the woods, and it disappeared here. This fire started right where it vanished." Frank and David stopped working, their shovels and hoses momentarily forgotten. They stared at me, their faces a mixture of disbelief and a flicker of something else, a shared, unspoken understanding that some things in the deep woods defy explanation. Frank, always the skeptic, grunted. Elias, you've been alone in that tower for 2 months. Your eyes are probably playing tricks on you. The mind can do funny things in isolation. I know what I saw, Frank, I said, my voice firm. It was a walking flame, and it left this. I gestured to the ash footprint and the contained embers. Beatrice sighed a long, weary sound. She looked from me to the peculiar fire, then back to the two stunned firefighters. All right, everyone, let's stick to the facts for the report. Elias reported a ground fire at these coordinates. We extinguished it. We found a peculiar warm stone. Well, log it all. As for the rest, it's just unusual circumstances. We don't need to add walking fire to the official record. She gave me a pointed look. You need to get some rest, Elias. We'll hike you back to the tower. And maybe a short leave isn't a bad idea. I didn't argue. I knew they wouldn't believe me, not fully, not with their rational, practical minds. But they had seen the peculiar nature of the fire, the ash footprint, and the strange, warm stone. That was enough. As they finished putting out the fire, meticulously raking over the last embers until nothing but damp earth remained, I took one last look at the spot where the ash footprint had been. It was gone, disturbed by their shovels. All that remained was a dark, wet patch on the forest floor, soon to be overgrown. We began the trek back to the tower, the three firefighters walking ahead of me, their conversation muted, their skepticism clearly visible in the set of their shoulders. Beatrice walked beside me, her expression thoughtful. Elias, she said softly, this forest. It has old stories, very old. Sometimes when you spend enough time here, you start to see them. What kind of stories, Beatrice? She shook her head. Stories of the fire sprites. Tiny, glowing figures that sometimes appear in the deepest parts of the woods, usually after a dry spell or before a storm. The old ones, the ones who lived here before anyone else, used to say they were the keepers of the forgotten burns. They would walk the land, clearing out the old, dead brush, preparing the ground for new growth, leaving behind small, perfect embers. Keepers of the forgotten burns. I repeated, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth of the morning sun. That's what they said. They don't hurt anything, they just tend to the forest in their own way, and they don't like to be seen. She paused, then looked at me, a flicker of something like respect in her eyes. You saw one, didn't you? I nodded, unable to speak. She simply patted my arm. Well, keep it to yourself, Elias. Some stories are best kept to the quiet, but it means you're really seeing the forest now. When we reached the tower, the sun was fully up, bathing Mount Cinder in bright, golden light. My tower, my sanctuary, looked solid and familiar, but it was no longer quite the same. It was now a witness, a silent observer to the impossible walking flames of the deep woods. I had found the quiet I sought, but it had come with a profoundly spooky, beautiful truth. I climbed the 60 steps back to my perch, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. My summer had taken a turn into the truly extraordinary, and I knew I wouldn't be able to look at the forest or the stars in quite the same way ever again. The walking flame was gone, but its story had just begun to unfold within me. The whispers of the old ones the next few days were marked by a peculiar stillness. The fire team had left, the official report filed with its deliberately understated language of unusual circumstances. Beatrice, with her quiet acknowledgment of the fire sprites, had given me a new lens through which to view my solitary world. I resumed my duties, making my quarter-hourly scans, but now my gaze was different. I wasn't just looking for smoke. I was looking for patterns, for the subtle shifts in the deep forest that might betray another presence. The story of the keepers of the forgotten burns resonated deeply. It felt right, a harmonious explanation for the impossible walking flame. It wasn't a monster, not an alien, but an ancient, elemental force, tending to the sacred cycles of the forest. The idea was cozy in its quiet purpose, yet profoundly spooky in its otherworldliness. I spent hours poring over old park maps that Beatrice had left with my supplies. These were not the standard tourist maps. They were hand-drawn, marked with faded pencil lines and cryptic annotations, passed down through generations of rangers. I looked for anything that might indicate fire sprites or forgotten burns, and I found it. In one corner of an old map, near the very section of forest where I had seen the walking flame, was a small, almost invisible symbol. A tiny, stylized flame enclosed in a circle with a single, faint arrow pointing southwest. Below it in tiny, almost illegible script were two words, the Ember Trail. I traced the arrow with my finger. It led to a particularly remote section of the forest, a deep canyon known as Whispering Gulch. It was a place rarely visited, even by rangers. The maps warned of unstable terrain, dense undergrowth, and a strange echo that carried sounds for miles. My curiosity, once satisfied by the quiet contemplation of my tower, was now a restless energy. I had to follow the Ember Trail. I had to find Whispering Gulch. I waited for my next supply drop. When Beatrice arrived, her face was still etched with a quiet knowing. She handed me a fresh stack of library books and my usual rations. "You're not planning any more night hikes, are you, Elias?" she asked, her eyes twinkling slightly. "Just reading up on local history, Beatrice," I replied, a small smile touching my lips. "I found a few mentions of fire sprites and ember trails in some of the older records." She nodded. "The old ones, they had a deep respect for this land. They saw things we don't. Or rather, we've forgotten how to see them." "What did they mean by Whispering Gulch?" I asked. Beatrice's smile faded slightly. "Whispering Gulch. It's where the old ones believed the spirits of the burned trees went to rest. They say the wind carries their stories through the canyon, and sometimes, if you listen very carefully, you can hear the embers singing. Singing, a low hum, a vibration in the air. The spirits, they say, are still tending to their old selves, preparing for the rebirth." She shrugged. "Old tales, but powerful ones." I packed my backpack that evening with a new sense of purpose. This time I had a destination, a direction, and a hint of what I might find. I waited until the moon was full, its soft, silver light illuminating the forest, making the journey less treacherous. I descended the tower steps, the familiar creak of the metal a comforting sound. My powerful headlamp cut a steady path, and my compass, no longer wobbling, pointed southwest along the faint Ember Trail. The hike was long, perhaps 8 miles, and the terrain lived up to its reputation. The undergrowth was thick, snagging at my clothes, and the path was steep in places, forcing me to use my hands to scramble over rocks. But the full moon bathed the forest in a ghostly, ethereal glow, transforming the daunting wilderness into a magical, shimmering landscape. As I approached Whispering Gulch, the air grew noticeably colder, even on this warm summer night. And the silence, that deep, pervasive quiet of the forest, began to shift. It was no longer the absolute void of the fire sprite clearing. It was a textured silence, a silence filled with subtle, barely audible sounds. I heard it first as a faint, almost subliminal hiss. It was like the sound of air escaping from a distant, slowly deflating balloon. Then, as I moved deeper into the canyon, the hiss resolved into a low, continuous hum. It wasn't loud, not jarring. It was a gentle, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself, rising up through the soles of my boots. This was the singing of the embers that Beatrice had mentioned. It was not a melodic song, but a deep, vibrational tone, a sound that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my chest. It felt ancient, patient, and full of quiet power. I reached the bottom of the gulch. It was a narrow, steep-sided canyon, its walls rising hundreds of feet, carved smooth by ancient floods. The bottom was flat, covered in a fine layer of silty sand and surprisingly clear of dense undergrowth. And there, stretching for perhaps a quarter of a mile down the center of the canyon floor, was the Ember Trail. It wasn't a path. It was a series of small, perfectly circular patches of dark, almost black earth spaced about 20 feet apart. Each patch was perhaps a foot in diameter, a small, dark disk against the pale sand. They weren't glowing now, they were cold, long-extinguished spots. I knelt down, touching one of the dark circles. The earth was slightly hardened, fused, similar to the scorched earth I had found at the Devil's Drink in Nevada, but on a much smaller, more subtle scale. It was as if a tiny, controlled ember had rested there, cooled, and left its quiet signature. As I walked along the Ember Trail, following the long, slow curve of Whispering Gulch, the hum grew slightly louder, more resonant. It felt like a vast, unseen energy was moving beneath the earth, flowing along this ancient, dark path. And then I saw it. At the very end of the Ember Trail, where the canyon opened up into a wider, more sheltered basin, was a single, immense petrified log. Not a standing tree, but a fallen giant, its trunk thick as a small car, stretching for 50 feet. It was completely turned to stone, its bark and grain perfectly preserved in solid, gray rock polished smooth by millennia of wind and sand. It was ancient, a monument to a forest that had stood here in a forgotten time. And around the base of the petrified log, arranged in a perfect, wide circle, were perhaps 24 of the small, dark Ember Trail patches. They formed a silent, ceremonial ring around the ancient, stone wood. I stood there in the profound, humming silence of Whispering Gulch, surrounded by the remnants of the Ember Trail and the vast, stone memory of the petrified log. I understood then that this wasn't just a fire. It was a ritual. The walking flames, the fire sprites, weren't simply tending to burns. They were enacting an ancient cycle, a slow, deliberate dance of decay and renewal. They were clearing the old, honoring the lost, and preparing the ground for the rebirth of the forest. The small embers they left behind were not destructive. They were ceremonial, energetic offerings to the ancient spirit of the land. I placed my hand on the cool, hard surface of the petrified log. The low hum resonated up through the stone, through my palm, and into my chest. It was a comforting vibration, a deep, earth-bound song of continuity. I sat down on a smooth, flat rock nearby, feeling profoundly at peace. The Fire Watch Tower, once a place of solitary escape, had become a gateway to an ancient, beautiful truth. The loneliness of my summer had led me to the quiet, powerful heart of the forest, where the impossible walked, and the embers sang their slow, patient song of memory. I stayed in Whispering Gulch until the first pale light of dawn began to touch the canyon rims. The hum slowly faded as the sun rose, the subtle energy of the night receding back into the earth. The Ember Trail, the petrified log, the entire silent canyon, it all returned to its normal, unmoving state, a perfect illusion of everyday reality. But I knew the truth. I knew the forest had its secret keepers, its silent, walking flames, tending to the slow, deep breath of its ancient cycles. My cozy, spooky summer had become a sacred vigil, and I was content to be a silent witness to its ongoing, beautiful mystery. I would return to the tower, and I would watch, not just for fires, but for the subtle, fleeting glimpses of the walking embers, the true heart of the deep, old woods. The seasonal shift and the elders' wisdom, the weeks that followed were infused with a new, profound sense of connection to the forest. My scans from the fire tower became less about vigilance and more about observation, a patient waiting for the subtle shifts in the landscape that might hint at the presence of the fire sprites. I never saw another walking flame, not a fully manifest one, but I often caught glimpses of unexplained glows, faint, amber flickers deep in the distant woods, particularly on dry, windless nights. Each one felt like a quiet confirmation, a whispered secret from the ancient forest. As September deepened, the forest began its slow, magnificent transformation. The aspens on the lower slopes turned a brilliant gold, then a vibrant orange, shimmering like liquid fire in the morning sun. The air grew crisper, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves and the sharp, clean smell of pine. Geese flew in vast, honking V-formations high overhead, their calls echoing across the vast wilderness, signaling the inevitable approach of winter. My bi-weekly supply drop with Beatrice became a quiet ritual of shared understanding. I didn't need to speak of the fire sprites directly. A knowing glance, a shared smile, a brief mention of the singing in Whispering Gulch was enough. She would always bring me new, older books from the ranger station's dusty backroom, tales of early pioneers, local Native American legends, and even a few speculative ethnobotanical texts. She was feeding my curiosity, acknowledging the profound shift in my perception. One crisp, clear afternoon, Beatrice stayed a little longer than usual. She brought a thermos of hot apple cider and sat with me in the small, glass-enclosed cabin of the tower, looking out at the vast, changing forest. "Winter's coming, Elias," she said, her voice soft. "They'll be pulling the watchers from the towers soon, probably late October." A pang of melancholy shot through me. I wasn't ready to leave the quiet, the solitude, the watchful contemplation. I wasn't ready to leave the possibility of seeing the walking flame again. "I'll miss it," I admitted, sipping the warm, spiced cider. "I know," she said, her gaze fixed on the distant, hazy blue of the mountains. "This place, it gets into your blood. And once it shows you its secrets, it's hard to forget them." She paused, then turned to me, a serious expression on her face. "There's an elder in the Ute tribe lives down near the reservation. Her name is Grandmother Willow. She's very old, almost 100. She knows all the stories, the real stories. She was born in these mountains, lived here her whole life. Her people are the ones who spoke of the fire sprites, the Ember Trail, the singing trees. If anyone can tell you more, it's her." "Grandmother Willow," I repeated, feeling a surge of quiet excitement. How would I find her? Beatrice took out a small, worn piece of paper from her pocket. On it was a rough, hand-drawn map with a single, clear circle marked in red ink. "Her cabin is off a forgotten road about an hour south of the reservation. She doesn't have a phone. You just arrive, bring tobacco, a simple offering, and listen more than you speak. She'll know why you've come." She handed me the map. "She doesn't talk to many outsiders, but I have a feeling she'll talk to you. You've seen the old ways, Elias. She'll recognize that in you." A few weeks later, in mid-October, the official call came over the radio. "Mount Cinder Tower, this is District 1. Prepare for winterization and evacuation. Last pickup will be October 28th. Over." My summer was over. My time in the tower was ending. But the journey of understanding the walking flame was not. On my final morning in the tower, I completed my last scan of the horizon. The forest was ablaze with autumn colors, a final, magnificent display before the long sleep of winter. I felt a deep, quiet gratitude for the tower, for the solitude it had offered, and for the impossible truths it had revealed. I packed my belongings slowly, meticulously. The leather-bound journal, filled with observations and the whispered lore of the Ember Trail, went into my backpack. The small, smooth, dark stone, the one the fire team had found, which retained a gentle internal warmth, I wrapped in a soft piece of linen and placed in my inner jacket pocket, a quiet amulet of the mountains. When Beatrice arrived in the heavy pickup truck, she didn't rush me. She helped me winterize the tower, shutting off the propane, sealing the windows, and strapping down the exterior equipment. The tower was returning to its sleeping state, a tall, silent sentinel awaiting the heavy snows. As we drove down the long, winding dirt road, the familiar path looked subtly different. It was less a route of escape and more a line of connection, a thread leading from the solitude of the high peaks to the human world below. "Y'all come back next year, want you, Elias?" Beatrice asked as we reached the paved highway, the truck's tires finally finding smooth purchase. "I hope so, Beatrice," I said, looking back at the distant ridge of Mount Cinder. "I have a feeling I haven't finished watching yet." She smiled, a knowing, serene expression. "The forest will wait for you. It knows you're listening now." She dropped me off at the nearest small town, a place called Silverton, where I had left my own vehicle, an old, reliable SUV. I thanked her not just for the supplies, but for the quiet, profound wisdom she had shared. "Go find Grandmother Willow," she said as I got out of the truck, "and let her stories settle into the quiet part of you." I drove south, following the route Beatrice had marked on the worn map. The transition was jarring. The roads were busier, the air was polluted with the faint scent of gasoline and exhaust, and the constant thrum of civilization felt like a low-grade headache after 2 months of profound silence. I stopped briefly to purchase the offering Beatrice had suggested, a small pouch of high-quality, fragrant tobacco. The drive to the Ute Reservation was long and uneventful, a necessary travel time that allowed my mind to process the shift from watchman to seeker. I was leaving the physical isolation of the tower, but entering the deliberate, cultural isolation of a remote community. Finally, I found the turnoff, an unmarked, deeply rutted dirt track that wound into a hidden, forested valley. The path was barely wide enough for my SUV, and I drove slowly, carefully, respecting the private, unhurried nature of the land. The valley opened up to a small, hidden meadow, and there, nestled beneath an enormous, ancient cottonwood tree, was Grandmother Willow's cabin. It was small, made of logs, its roof covered with grass and moss. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, carrying a comforting scent of burning cedar. I parked the car a respectable distance away and walked toward the cabin. Grandmother Willow and the cycle of embers. I found Grandmother Willow sitting on a wooden bench outside her cabin, bundled in a thick woven shawl, her face turned toward the afternoon sun. She was small, frail-looking, but her presence was immense, radiating a quiet, ancient power. Her hair was a braid of brilliant white, and her face was a masterpiece of deep, weathered lines, each one a testament to a lifetime lived in quiet observance of the land. As I approached, I took a deep breath, clutching the pouch of tobacco. She did not look at me immediately. She simply sat, listening to the wind rustling the remaining golden leaves of the cottonwood. I stopped a few feet away and knelt, placing the tobacco gently on the ground before her bench. "Grandmother Willow," I said softly. She turned her head slowly. Her eyes, the color of deep, polished obsidian, looked directly into mine. They were sharp, clear, and seemed to look right through the surface of my skin, past my nerves, and into the core of my purpose. "The watcher has left his high house," she said, her voice a low, dry rustle like leaves scraping across the ground. It was not a question, but a statement of simple fact. "Yes, grandmother," I replied. "And the tower was too quiet," she continued, her lips barely moving. "So the old quiet, the one that walks, came to meet you. She hadn't needed to ask why I was there." Beatrice was right, she already knew. She knew the secret of the walking flame. I sat back on my heels, waiting patiently, respecting the deep, slow rhythm of her conversation. "Tell me what you saw, Elias," she finally instructed. I recounted the entire experience, starting with the immense solitude of the tower, the fear and awe of seeing the small, amber flame move in the chaos of the night, the impossible sight of the human shape, and the finding of the small, contained fire with the ash footprint. I told her about the Ember Trail and the humming silence of Whispering Gulch. I spoke slowly, deliberately, using the quiet, precise language I had learned in my isolation. I even pulled the small, warm stone from my pocket and placed it on the ground beside the tobacco pouch. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, her eyes closed, her face turned toward the sun. I did not interrupt her contemplation. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the distant, soothing trickle of water. She finally opened her eyes and picked up the warm stone. She turned it over and over in her palm, her fingers gnarled but steady. "This is not volcanic glass," she said, her voice soft but firm. "This is a heart stone. It is the last coal from the deep fire, the fire that never burns out, only sleeps. You have seen the fire dancers, not sprites, dancers. They are the memory of the forest. When the world becomes too cluttered, too loud, too cold, they walk. They are the spirit of the necessary burn, the cleansing fire." She explained that the watchers were not merely people tending a garden as I had dreamed, but a collective consciousness, a living embodiment of the forest's cyclical memory. Their purpose was not to destroy, but to prepare. "When the leaves fall, the old ones are sad," she said, looking at the cottonwood. "But the fire dancers come and clean the ground. They walk over the dead wood, and where they step, they leave a seed coal, a small, perfect ember. The embers are not for burning, they are for waking. Waking what, grandmother? The fire that is asleep in the seed. Seed, every root, every sleeping creature holds the breath of the next summer. The dancer touches the earth, leaves the heart stone's warmth, and reminds the forest of the potential," she explained. "The ash footprint you saw, it was not a shadow. It was the dancer pressing the life back into the ground, ensuring the cycle continues." She placed the warm stone back on the ground, then picked up the pouch of tobacco. "You followed the Ember Trail. You found the singing place. The silence there is not a shield, Elias. It is a focus. It is where the dancers gather the forest story, its losses, its triumphs, its deepest memories, before they start their walk." She looked at me, her obsidian eyes incredibly gentle. "You saw the fire in the wind because the wind was too loud. The storm lowered the veil. It showed you the quiet workers who tend to the world when we are not watching." The entire narrative clicked into place, a perfect, complete, and profoundly comforting mythology. The walking flame wasn't a danger or an alien. It was a deeply patient, beautiful part of the natural rhythm. It was the forest's own quiet ritual of self-renewal. I stayed with Grandmother Willow until the sun began to sink below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. We didn't speak much more. She simply watched the sky, and I sat in her immense, profound silence, absorbing the quiet certainty of her words. As the air grew chilly, she rose slowly, deliberately, and gestured toward the path. "You have the story now, Elias," she said. "Go and tell it slowly. Tell it with respect. Tell it in the quiet time when people are ready to listen, when the lights are low. That is how the deep truth should be shared." I gathered my things, the leather-bound journal, the small, warm heartstone, and the knowledge of the fire dancers. I bowed deeply to Grandmother Willow, a gesture of profound respect and gratitude. "Thank you, Grandmother. I will keep the quiet." She smiled faintly. "The quiet is keeping you, Elias. Go now. The winter sleep is long, and the forest needs its story told." I walked back to my car, the warmth of the heartstone radiating gently through my jacket. I was no longer a solitary escapee seeking quiet. I was a quiet messenger, a holder of the forest's beautiful, slow, burning secret. My summer had ended, but my journey of observation had just begun its long, meandering path into the quietest parts of the world. The winter sleep and the contemplative drive home, the drive back to the east, toward my home, became a long, meditative process. The physical distance was vast, stretching across the high plains and rolling hills, but the internal distance I had traveled was far greater. I drove slowly, intentionally avoiding the frantic pace of the interstate, sticking instead to the lonely state highways that cut through the silent, sleeping countryside. The world outside my window was entering its own deep slumber. Fields were brown and harvested, trees stood bare and skeletal against the gray sky, and the air held the crisp, clean scent of approaching frost. It was a season of quiet recession, a vast, natural metaphor for the story I carried. I stopped frequently, finding small, isolated rest areas or quiet pull-offs near frozen rivers. I would sit, always with the heartstone in my palm, and write in my journal, transcribing the intricate details of Grandmother Willow's lore. I wrote about the seed coal, the potential, and the comforting concept that the impossible walking flame was, in fact, an act of love toward the land, a ritual of quiet, perpetual renewal. The quiet, reflective tone of the journey was the final, necessary chapter of my story. It allowed the dramatic events, the terror of the walking flame, the mystery of the Ember Trail, the profound wisdom of the elder to settle, dissolving the fear and leaving behind only a deep, peaceful awe. I realized that the entire experience was designed to be slow. The fire dancers moved slowly. The forest renews slowly. The truth came to me slowly, through 2 months of solitude, an arduous night hike, the meticulous work of the fire team, the quiet research in old maps, and finally, the patient explanation of Grandmother Willow. The power of the story lay not in the spectacle, but in its deliberate pace. One evening, I stayed overnight in a small, isolated cabin near a lake that was already beginning to freeze over. I lit a small fire in the stone hearth and watched the silent, consuming dance of the flames. It was the first fire I had lit since leaving the tower, and I watched it with new eyes, seeing not just the physical combustion, but the elegant, elemental act of release and preparation. I held the heart stone near the warmth. It seemed to pulse faintly, absorbing the heat, reminding me that even the fire was a temporary, contained state, a transitional moment in the endless cycle of the forest's life. The walking flame was a mobile, conscious ember, a point of focused energy moving along the lines of the Earth's memory. I wrote in my journal, "The spooky is only the unknown. Once known, it is only cozy." The walking flame is the forest's heartbeat, slow and patient. My focus shifted from the external mystery to the internal change. The Fire Watcher's summer had succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. I had gone seeking solitude to quiet the noise of my own life, and in return, the solitude had offered me a truth so profound and quiet that it silenced everything else. As I drove across the final state line, the landscape became familiar, but my perception of it remained alien, infused with the quiet magic of the White River forest. I saw the bare branches of the deciduous trees not as dead wood, but as the quiet preparation for the next green explosion. I saw the distant factory smoke not as a mere plume of pollution, but as a loud, frantic contrast to the silent, purposeful movement of the fire dancers. I reached my small apartment in the city late one evening. The city was loud, insistent, and overwhelmingly bright. The noise of traffic and the glare of streetlights felt abrasive after the deep blackness of Mount Cinder. I unpacked slowly. The first thing I did was place the heart stone on my bedside table, next to my journal. The stone was cool now, but solid, a perfect anchor in the chaos. I knew that the most important part of Grandmother Willow's instruction remained, to tell the story slowly in the quiet time. I sat down at my desk, pulled out my journal, and began to write the story of the summer, translating the hurried, trembling notes of that first night into the slow, meditative prose of the ambient whispers style. I focused on the deep texture of the forest, the rhythmic tink-tink-tink of the cooling tower, the subtle hiss in Whispering Gulch, and the profound, beautiful impossibility of the walking flame. The memory was no longer a jarring fear, but a quiet, comforting truth. The forest was protected, tended to by the elegant, silent choreography of the fire dancers. I finished the draft late in the night. I read it over one last time, ensuring the tone was calm, contemplative, and infused with that deep, peaceful reverence I had found on Mount Cinder. I turned off the light. The room plunged into a soft, urban darkness. I lay in bed, feeling the low, insistent hum of the city around me. I closed my eyes and focused on the coolness of the heart stone, its silent presence a perfect internal node, reminding me of the absolute, clean silence of the high peaks. And as I drifted towards sleep, I didn't think of the loud, demanding world I had returned to. I thought only of the vast, sleeping forest, where even on the coldest winter night the tiny, human-shaped flames were quietly walking, pressing the promise of warmth and life into the frozen, quiet earth, tending to the potential of the next spring. The mystery was over, replaced by a soft, enduring peace, the deepest, most gentle kind of sleep. Thank you for listening. For more content and support, please like, comment, and subscribe.